Great, well, thank you. So we've heard some phenomenal talks so far, specifically about technology. I thought what might be interesting for me to do this time is to talk about something that's IDEO's approach. So it's almost our equivalent to agile programming in how we create innovative concepts. And we call that design thinking. And then I'll hopefully just take you through some specific ways that every one of you can apply design thinking to your startup. So if we start off by asking the question, what is it? What is design thinking? Really quick perspective. So traditional thinking, particularly in big companies, you can imagine, is convergent. We actually encourage businesses to be efficient, more and more efficient all the time, and that's actually about closing down opportunities. Some of the most successful firms spend all of their time making choices, converging on a solution, and then implementing it. Like a lot of companies would call that the exploitation phase. Now, the problem with that is it's inherently uncreative. It's absolutely not a creative process. In fact, it's the opposite. You're incentivizing people to close down options. So the alternative, which we get really excited about, is actually creating choices, finding ways to give you new options. Now, startups, inherently, you guys do it. You absolutely understand how to do this. This is actually one of the reasons why startups can destroy big companies, because they've spent all their time limiting their options, becoming efficient, exploiting their idea, and the startups can come in and they can explore new ideas and actually create new choices with new approaches. So I'll talk to you about how we do that. We basically call this approach, where we try and perform both exercises at once. Some people would call it integrative thinking, but we call it design thinking. This is what IDEO does in our projects, particularly for big clients. In order to come up with and create new choices that really work, and you'll see the business model that we talked through, they combine three things. We have to make sure that the idea appeals to people. We have to make sure that we can make money from the idea, but also we have to make sure that the idea can be done. So we look to create choices in the middle here, and those are the ones that change markets. And to help engage ourselves in that process, we use both sides of our brains. So you've got the traditional left brain thinking, right brain thinking. You could have mapped them on that previously. The important thing is to keep both in mind. And so what we'll do, I'll switch you across to some specific examples of actually how you can create completely new choices in startups. So we work across a few industries. I've just picked out the aspects that specifically I think are relevant to startups. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to lay them out in the order of your development process. I've tried to run them through. So we'll start off thinking about how you start off. We'll then move into the research phase and some of the stuff we do to research ideas, to come up with new ideas. Then I'll talk a bit about the build phase. So actually how you can make it differently as a result of this process. And then I'll talk about shipping it, getting to beta, how we can learn fast in that process. So this actually says 12, you've got an extra one free, there'll be 13 here. There's some video embedded in this, that's an experiment, none of us have done that yet, so we'll see if it works. But my first one for all of you, and I think probably for me the most important, is keep challenging questions. Like keep challenging your assumptions. I don't just mean challenging the answers, the orthodox sort of answers that you've come up with. Challenge the questions as well. Because that's how you really disrupt markets. The best startups reframed the question. They asked it in a different way. So when you guys find yourselves falling back into the mindset of asking the same questions as the companies you're competing with, you've got a problem. Keep challenging those questions. So the next one is think hard about who you involve at the early stage. Who's going to be constructive? And one of the things that we've learned from that, I think, is diversity is a good thing. So this is actually an exercise we did to ask people to show things they love from all of our different offices. We love that diversity. Sometimes it's a painful process, it's abrasive, but that tension can be really creative. So actually in your team, make sure you've got that little bit of abrasion. Make sure there's someone that pushes back and says, no, I don't agree. I don't think it should be done like that. And make sure that actually they have the forum where they can share those views. A similar point is involve partners in the process. So out there in the world, there are a whole lot of people that are smarter about specialist subjects that you're working on than you guys. Fact. Involve them in the process. So this is one where we were designing a water storage solution in the Indian market. And the first thing we did was involve charities and water officials on the ground in India to get their input. Always involve people smarter than the core team because you learn faster. So that's kind of a summary of framing the question and setting the company up right. Now we're into research. So we talked a lot about user-centeredness, I think. I don't want you guys to roll your eyes and think user-centered. What I want to show you is I think there's some interesting other ways of doing that. So the first one is we always really try and get to grips with our user. Now, a lot of people will think that's just looking in through a one-way mirror. It doesn't work. You can do more than that. You can actually learn a lot more about your users than just, observing them through a mirror in a false environment. And the best way of learning about your users is actually watching them live, understanding how they spend their time. Now, the cool thing for tech businesses, there are loads of, look at that, I accidentally grabbed a bit of my tweet deck, but so one of the tools that I think we've started using more and more, it's incredibly cheap, it's like $100, and it allows you actually to monitor people's usage of your site. It'll record their cursor movements, it uses their inbuilt camera to watch their reactions, and you can track it through the screen. So just seeing how people navigate through the system can be incredibly interesting, great learning. So that's kind of watching them use your products. But the other thing I'd suggest is that you guys actually get out there and try and really empathize with your end consumers. So who's going to tell me first what they think this is? A ceiling. So why is a ceiling important? Where's this ceiling? In an office.
The office.
Oh, it could be the office. So the reason this is interesting, we did a project for a hospital. And the hospital said to us, we want you to look at our consumer, our patient experience. You know what? You've just seen it. You've just seen the whole patient experience. People are wheeled around and this is all they see. So if we were to walk in there and look at the floor, it's not relevant. The consumers aren't seeing it. So diving into the way that people actually use services, products, your products can be incredibly revealing. I'll give you another example. So how many of you think that a mobile phone novel is a good idea? Cell phone novels, good idea? Some people, very few people think it's a good idea. In the European markets, I'm not sure it's a great idea. But if you think about the Japanese market, it's unbelievably successful. So Japanese market, you've seen cell novels grow incredibly from about 2003 when it's first done. And there's some really interesting cultural reasons why they do incredibly well there. There's the simple fact that, the Japanese grammar fits really well onto mobile phone screens. It's a different context in that case. You've got some other really interesting things like often ladies, sort of the youngest end of the spectrum, want to read romantic novels and it's embarrassing. So historically, if they open up a book, you're projecting what you're reading. It's like, hey, look at me, I'm reading romance. That's embarrassing. So it became a natural move to move it onto the cell phone, where actually you're no longer projecting what you're reading. The cell phone brings extra advantages that are culturally specific to Japan. So just remembering this cultural context and diving into that content, for us, I think, all of us in our projects is incredibly important. To give you an example, one of the biggest successes which I saw this year, just saw some internet activity on it, was a author, Japanese author called Bunny. who's a 15-year-old schoolgirl who wrote the whole novel on her cell phone, and it was downloaded 110,000 times. She wrote this thing on her cell phone to optimize the experience on the cell phone. So again, she's one of the users. She dived into it. So for us to use our cultural instincts and say, bad idea, be a mistake. It's an incredibly unique context. So another suggestion we might have for you guys is to look at analogous environments. So we, in projects in the past where we're looking at emergency theatres for hospitals, have looked at things like NASCAR, because it's similar. It's a very high-stress environment. You have to have an incredibly fixed set of responsibilities across the board. So look at analogous environments in yours. I think for the Deadline guys, there's all sorts of interesting analogous stuff there. An actual PA, watching PAs handle people's diaries is a really interesting inspiration. For others, watching concierge. For Flock of Birds, there's other recommendation services that we can learn from. So look at analogous environments and you'll learn from them definitely. It can take you only an hour to disappear out of your office or studio or bedroom, and you just have a new insight. You see some new stuff, which is always going to be a good thing. The other one that I think is really, really useful is looking to extreme users. So as human beings, we have this sort of propensity to put everything on a bell curve, even if it's not true. I don't know if it's true in this case either. However, if you think about the outliers of any consumer segment, they can be very revealing. So using the Deadline as a specific example, if you imagine that this spectrum in this context is time availability, you can look at the two extremes might be retired people with so much time they don't know what to do, or successful executives that try and fit 1 million activities into a day. If you think about the trend of where the market's going, I'm afraid we're generally moving into a busier lifestyle. So probably the main market's going in this direction. So looking at the busiest guys out here for inspiration can be incredibly revealing, because their behaviors can be suggestions of what everybody would be doing in a few years. So look to extremes to keep that. So again, this is another research. And here's an example which we found pretty inspiring. So we did a project for a big bank, and we were trying to understand credit. So we looked at two extremes. We looked at somebody that was totally cool with credit and had huge amounts of debt, but we also looked at people that were scared by credit, and this is the best example. Can anyone tell me what this is? Yeah, so why would you put a credit card in the freezer?
So you can use it.
Exactly. So this lady was so scared of credit that she froze her credit card, and then she'd know she'd have to wait for it to thaw out before she could use it. So it became a sort of sanity check. So again, this behavior is happening all the time. I saw one actually last week, which I was inspired by. I don't know if any of you use The Economist. So you can pull great podcasts off iTunes on The Economist. But there's now an option on there that you can actually increase the speed by 2 times. And the mechanism for that, like I went on and I thought, oh, this is good. I can absorb twice as much information, but I'm going to have to listen to something that sounds like a chipmunk. It's not true. What they've done is they've written a program that clips out the pauses, so it just accelerates the whole program by dropping the pauses. And I think what they probably did very wisely is they looked out at their readership and realized that time for their readers is probably the most valuable commodity. So how can they give their readers more time? What a great solution. So I think looking at extremes can actually unlock that sort of information. I also look at business models. I can bore you guys about why American Idol disrupted the whole music industry over a beer. I don't know if you'd actually want me to do that, because I can really go on the subject. But I look at industry disruptors all the time for inspiration, business model disruptors, because without exception, the guys actually turn the incumbents, the big companies' strengths into their weaknesses. So for example, Blockbusters, is a disaster at the moment. In the past, their greatest strength was their retail footprint. Netflix has turned their retail footprint into their Achilles heel and is killing the business by using the new channel of the internet and actually providing a better service. Algorithms that allow you to understand which you might enjoy, recommendation engines. Some great stuff in that. So looking at the established models, and more excitingly for me, the disruptors is always interesting, and it doesn't need to be the industry you're in. Look at disruptors outside your industry, because they can be inspiring stories. So we're moving towards the end of research and into the design phase now for you guys. The next one we think is really, really important is thinking the whole journey. Now, if you imagine your whole experience of selling your product, you've got classic sort of marketing journeys or sales cycles where you find out about the product, you purchase it, you use it, hopefully you reuse it, and then you recommend it. You can actually plot any journey through the sales cycle lens, or actually the experience journey. You've got one here that we looked at, a train system in the States, the Acceler Express. This is the journey there. What we know is that you are as strong or as weak as your weakest point in this journey. So if you're just designing this middle section here, you've got a big problem if the completion exercise is a disaster. If you're tapping into other programs and the other programs, the experience is not strong, guess what? You're going to lose your customer because they think it's part of your experience. So understanding what doesn't work across the whole experience journey is super important. Next thing we do is we always prototype. So I wanted to give you some examples outside technology to show you actually how you guys are the luckiest people in the world. There's businesses out there that make products, that make services. They're all prototyping those. We have absolutely no excuse for not prototyping every tech product that we're looking at. We should have a clickable test incredibly quickly. I was inspired by Tamo, who last time we went for dinner, we had a great conversation, and Tamo had built basically a working alpha prototype within 3 hours of the conversation so that we could discuss something. And that as a tool, a prototype tool, is much more interesting than just talking about words on a piece of paper. It works across languages, it works across perspectives. Prototyping is incredibly valuable. This is one that a medical device company where we got the surgeons to describe what they would like the feel of the device to be, and they prototyped it with a whiteboard marker, and this is now in the market. So it can be done with products, it can even be done with experiences. You know, people are prototyping McDonald's stores in Chicago. They have whole stores in warehouses. They did it when Tesco's were moving into the supermarket industry in the States. They built behind closed doors a complete supermarket. People are prototyping this stuff, so how can we not prototype everything that we have as an idea in tech products? We can turn it around in hours rather than these can be weeks. Another, and I won't dwell on this one because I actually think art has done a phenomenal job of talking to some of this stuff in Ruxandra yesterday. But one of the things that I find really useful is trying to link back your designs to your original insights. Because actually those insights can be incredibly important for your brand and marketing message. So we've had some good talks on this subject, but don't just think if you're designing your UI and you go out and get insight around UI that you should only apply that insight to UI. You should apply it across everything. We talked about how that holistic view is important. So this is a self-warming baby bottle that we did the strategy for the business, the product, the brand. And one of the things we learned very early on was the importance of the humanness in the actual design of the product. And so we reflected that across everything, the packaging, the messaging, the branding. You can even see the colors reflect that stuff. As and when you initially are testing stuff in the market, I think we're strong advocates for being open. So I think Innocent is a great branding example for that. I'm inspired by their first line here. This is their ethics on their homepage. We sure aren't perfect, but we're trying to do the right thing. It's just a lovely, honest claim. Any company this is true for all of us. So why not put it out there? It bonds with the consumer. I think it becomes an interesting imperative actually in itself. This honesty actually forms an emotional lock. You sort of befriend a company rather than transact with it. So openness, honesty, transparency are incredibly useful. So now we're moving into the final design. I did a talk on this yesterday, so I won't dwell on it, but it's just a reminder, like you're as strong as or as weak in the journey, you're as strong or as weak as the weakest point in your whole business model. So take care over every aspect. That's partly why we go through the exercises here that we do. And that includes the non-consumer facing stuff. So final 3 from me. The next one, we've talked a lot about build it, ship it. You can call it launching to learn. But this mindset, I think, is absolutely the future. You can gain insights, you can have conversations, but ultimately there will be stuff you don't know. And the best way to learn the stuff you don't know is to stick it out in the market and watch. So ship it early. So I'd love to just share this. I don't know if any of you have seen this.
Hi, Hulme. What do I do? This is crazy. You. That's not a free upgrade check. You can do for a new smartphone. Don't I need to go to my carrier store for that?
You don't have to. We sell phones and plans on all the major networks.
Okay, well, is time travel possible?
Yes, I can promise you a check.
Phones, plans, and events.
Okay, anyone seen that campaign before? Okay, so it's a campaign by Best Buy. Impressively, there wasn't much branding on there, but Best Buy, I think in this case, have actually addressed one of the big things which it takes. When you're launching to learn, it takes bravery. It takes commitment. You have to be open to feedback. So I was inspired by these guys who last year decided they would actually establish a hashtag called Twelpforce, and they would turn every one of their employees into a customer service agent. So they now have 30,000 people or 27,600 followers, and people are perpetually sending them electronic-based suggestions and requests. So you can see one here. This is an answer. He's obviously Kevin792, I'm guessing, is a Best Buy employee, and he's answered some question about the protection plan, etc. This is an incredibly brave move for a business. We should be doing the same thing, being completely open and finding ways to learn smartly. The thing I loved about this is they actually turned Twitter into a phenomenal feedback engine. They established a hashtag, they opened themselves up. You can imagine in the boardroom in Best Buy, the guy saying, maybe the corporate social responsibility guy saying, but you know what, people will just go on there and say we're idiots all day. You can imagine that conversation, it would have happened, but they were brave. They said, well, better they do that on our platform than someone else's, and let's show them that's not the case with our behavior. So when you guys initially launch your beta, how can you stay really open to feedback? You can use tools like Get Satisfaction, but just enabling everyone to understand it. So in your team, setting up hashtags and asking for feedback from users, whether it's good or bad, in a public way, I think it's an incredibly strong move for you guys to consider. I also think there's amazing tools that we can use that aren't harnessed at the moment for research. So going back to the research phase, it's actually something Art said that made me think of this, but when you guys are testing value propositions, why not take out Google AdWords for the value propositions, pay a small amount of money, put them up there and see which consumers click on? How much does that cost you? It costs you virtually nothing, and you get feedback as to which words are important to consumers. I'd suspect you can probably spend less than $100 and get feedback about the top 5 words that your sort of consumer types are clicking on. Why not do it? Just get it out there and run the experiment so you can prototype all that stuff. And the final one for you before I show a really short video of final 2. As and when you launch, if you're going to be open, you're going to solicit feedback. The only bad thing you can do is not act on the feedback. So you have to iterate. You have to show people that you're responding to the feedback and improving it. I think the Deadline guys have done a phenomenal job of that. This is one that inspired me. It's actually a guy who finished business school in Boston, and he basically said to himself, I want to open a restaurant. but I don't know where my restaurant should be, and I don't know what type of food I should serve. So what's the way for me to really iterate a restaurant proposition? I know I'll get a white van, I'll write a different menu on it every day, and I'll drive it to a different place every day. It's prototyping of a whole restaurant business here. We have to be able to prototype tech businesses. So final one, which is probably as important as challenging the questions, so important ones to start and finish. The final one is to stay optimistic. Like, there's going to be times, it's a roller coaster ride running a startup. Any of us that have done that know that. There's good days, bad days. When you're starting to do well, you have really good days and sometimes really bad days. Staying optimistic is a massively important characteristic. Having that energy right through the process. And so, I don't know, if there was a way I could measure that excitement and energy, that would be for me the most important test of new businesses. It's the dynamicism of the team and their energy and their desire to continue pushing forward. So I'll share with you a video finally that for me did a good job of bringing together some of these points. It was a way of challenging a question. They prototyped very quickly, they created new behaviours and they iterated it. And this is actually a Volkswagen campaign. And they initially were they gave themselves the challenge, how do we get people to use the escalator less? And so you imagine, very traditional question, that one, and the answer is often, oh, slow down the escalator and then people will want to use the stairs, or make it less comfortable, then people will want to use the stairs. But I love the way they actually reframed the question and instead thought, how can we make the stairs more fun? So that's design thinking for startups.